Welcome everyone to our panel discussion about sustainability options for the new long range. Today we are going to be here live on the ILA and have a discussion in person, luckily. Unfortunately my colleague Annika Paul cannot join. She was also supposed and is on the program, so yeah. And of course we have as well physical visitors also as our listeners and viewers online, so I'm happy that you tuned in, I guess, and I'm happy that you joined us for the discussion. And I'm looking forward to our exchange. Our topic, improvements of the operations, is very, very important. We also see in the Waypoint program that operations are considered with a goal of 10%, and this has a large impact on the net zero, net emission for the air traffic, and should not be neglected in the plans. And it's a very important thing because maybe it's even easier to achieve goals faster there than it is on a technological path. Furthermore, there have been options actually identified for that, as we see in the Destination 2050 plan. And we have there different options for ground operations, like electric taxiing and other things. On the airline operation side, like weight reduction of amenities that are carried with the aircraft, and also airspace and ATM topics, of course, like reducing the borders in the airspace and so on. However, these goals, as specific as they are planned, do only amount to 5 to 6%, so they are even shy of the 10% prognosed. In our opinion, it should be able to achieve a bigger reduction, and I think there are a lot of topics and a lot of fields where we actually are able to have an impact that can be fast and decisive for the climate reduction. And for us, the long range is a very attractive application there, because although it does not have the biggest share in passenger transport or flight movements, it has a very substantial share actually on the global CO2 emissions of the air traffic control. And it has some unique challenges from the network structure, but it is very important, and for us it's very important. The discussion, however, will not be focused only on the long-range market, but we will probably also discuss some smaller segments and if there are options that actually can be applied to all of the market segments. So with this, I would like to introduce our panel. Myself, I'm Fabian Peter. I work at Bauhaus Luftfahrt, and I'm coordinating there the aircraft design. My colleague Annika Paul, who cannot be with us today, she actually works on the operations side. And we introduced 3 experts on this. We are very happy that they joined us, and I would like to introduce first Jurgen Lingbeck. He consulted airline top management since 1986 with McKinsey, also as a partner there, and later with Booz & Company. Currently, he is active in several roles, including teaching on several management topics and as an active investor in the Ricon company that was actually founded by him. Next to his industrial activities, he also supported political institutions as the World Tourism Organization, for example, and supported them in strategic developments. Next to Jürgen, there's Wolfgang Grimmer. He is a research assistant at the German Aerospace Center on the Institute of Air Transport and Airport Research. He's focusing on network structures. In this role, he supported the German Environmental Agency in several projects and the Clean Sky 2 technology evaluator. He furthermore leads the DGLR group for air traffic and is on the board of the directors for the German Aviation Research Society. Next to Wolfgang, there's Christian Soeck. He wrote his PhD on airline business models with Jurgen Lingbeck actually as a supervisor. Thereafter, he worked at Bain & Company consulting airlines on operational and network topics, and in 2021 he founded the Skailark company to provide services around data of the global aviation fleet. First of all, I would actually like to ask specific questions to the panelists who will then give an answer to that. And this question is that we just saw some options that are well known, that we know actually for the operations. And what do you think are supplementary options do we have to increase the efficiency? And what do you think should be focused, or what is missing in this list? And I would like to start with you, Jürgen.
Yeah, thank you, Fabian, for inviting me. And just to start with, I will highlight a little bit the view of the airlines and the government on that topic. First of all, I believe we are in a situation where punctuality and cancellations are more the reality than ever after the Corona breakdown and now the ramp up of the industry. So it's very, very important to get the operations up and running at the old seat load factor levels and capacity levels. And in that respect, the ideas which are mentioned in the Waypoint report and result in the 10% estimate are by no means the limit. There has to be a lot more to be done, specifically because the air traffic worldwide will more or less triple in the next 30 years. So if you look in with such a long horizon, it means we have to do something different. So there are a number of ideas, but on a high level you can start, if you look at the airlines, you can start with the operations. And what I always look at is a digitization in that business. And we have a tradition of complex IT systems in airline operations and air traffic operations. However, in the moment, we have first pilots even with KI systems, artificial intelligence systems, and see they work a lot better. So there's a significant short-term impact even. So if we now look forward into the future, we will see another disruption in digitization in the next 10, 15 years. We will have quantum computers, whatever. You could imagine there's a lot more possible than we have imagined even today. But even beyond this digitization of operations, I think it's important to look at the business model of the long haul in itself. And there are two big questions, I think, which could make a difference. One is really rethinking the mega hub system like it's done in Dubai. Could we do it differently? And the other one is really thinking about long haul point to point in a different way, that we are a lot more energy efficient and thereby, of course, also carbon efficient. If from a government perspective, there is a significant role for the government here. It really starts with transparency and it will continue with incentives. On the transparency side, today we are looking just at the number of CO2 tons. We don't look really at the quotient, CO2 ton divided by RPA, revenue passenger kilometers, so capacity, or ASK or RPK. So in that respect, there is a significant chance if we create transparency in the sector here. So what does it really mean? How can we reduce the number of flight hours on a flight and thereby shorten the distance on a certain flight? How can we reduce the number of flights by increase capacity of aircraft strategically? So these all would be questions which have to be incentivized. And I think ICAO is in the right position to do so. And finally, I would say it's really very much about really the competition and open sky environment. I have always seen in the last 20 years, 30 years, that deregulation was a significant impact, a very positive impact, not only on traffic and connectivity of the people, but also on efficiency, seat load factors, and energy efficiency. So we have to be sure that this is not stopping, but it's really continued in a global world, specifically for long-haul traffic. And today, I think we are highly regulated, as we know, and we even don't have airlines, really transatlantic type of airlines, which run a kind of integrated capacity, point to point on the intercontinental. So there are lots of opportunities. We just have to capture it, and the regulator have, of course, to support us.
I think a lot of very important points, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later. But Wolfgang, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm very happy. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also to Jurgen for addressing the issue of carbon dioxide reduction and the necessity to look at this very much in detail. I would also like to address the topic of non-CO2 effects. I mean, the topic of our panel discussion today is new trends in sustainability for long-haul travel, and non-CO2 effects have a very, very big role in long-haul travel, as we have contrails, we fly over long distances, we fly also at night, which has some warming effects. And I think the scientific advances in this area have made very big progress over the last years. So the current state
state of knowledge is that the non-CO2 effects have about 50% of the total climate effect. And there are, I think, also possibilities to reduce the non-CO2 effects with relatively low CO2 penalties or cost penalties for the airline. So that's something that has to be incentivized. But there are certainly also further aspects we should look at. I understand that Airbus has just only recently tested formation flight over the Atlantic, so something very innovative, coming away from the past very high separation of aircraft on the North Atlantic track. So there also, in combination with digital artificial intelligence, something could be created to reduce emissions, probably not by much, but it's still again another part of the overall puzzle. And finally also, I would think that we have to reconsider the network structures that we have currently in long-haul travel. So for instance, on the one hand, we have some economies of scale, large aircraft, people that are collected at the hubs and flying in one big plane over long distances, which is probably positive. But on the negative side, we have quite some detours also. Recently, a friend of mine flew from Warsaw to Singapore via London. So that is something that added maybe 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers to the overall travel distance. And I think there we have to look at to what extent also new technologies can change the network structures and make it more efficient in this regard.
Very well. I think there are also a lot of topics there in university, and I already realized that there are, of course, some combinations. Christian, I'm sure you also have an opinion.
Yeah, many thanks, and thanks to both of you for sort of touching upon the topic that I would like to address. So you just mentioned networks in long-haul flying, and that's something that I'd like to address today. So I think when we think about fuel and carbon emission savings, I think we have to start thinking out of the box and also consider some untouchable aspects, or for airlines maybe untouchable aspects. And one example I would like to touch upon is the route aircraft allocation. So which aircraft do I fly on which route? And what we see today often is that many airlines fly aircraft on certain routes which have a lot larger route capabilities, so they could actually fly much longer. Take an example, the A350 flying from London to New York. That's great, but it could also continue to Mexico City and beyond. So this additional distance or sort of range capability that's being carried also on the short route means that there's just additional weight in that aircraft that's being carried around. And that additional weight means additional fuel consumption, which also means additional emissions. So that's something I would like to think through further. I think the airlines and the network planners will have a different opinion, because they would like to not give up any operational flexibility. But however, this brings me to an interesting idea or sort of insights from the data that we publish and that we use, which is the A321neo long range and the XLR, which is supposed to come. And what we see in our data, that despite that narrow body aircraft having 50% less seats, that on a per seat level the emissions can be up to 20% lower compared to flying a wide body on that identical route. So you mentioned, Wolfgang, economies of scale, so that would be sort of a disadvantage of scale. It's not the scale part, it's the route capability aspect that's the problem. But I'd like to sort of bring that in the picture, because then you also touched upon the sort of the hubbing aspect. And I think if you have a narrow body which is able to fly longer hauls, you can fly those point-to-point routes, so the passenger does not have to connect through different other airports, therefore less detours, which means per passenger, again, fewer emissions. So I think that's something to consider. Of course, there's cargo and these things that have to be part of the picture, but I'd like to draw some attention, because I believe there's quite a significant potential for savings. And very quickly, a second aspect you touched upon, Jurgen, about transparency, and I think fuel emissions transparency for passengers is essential. Think about like the Nutri-Score for airlines, so that actually every passenger very transparently can understand what are the emissions on a specific flight I choose. Google has started doing that, and also some other online travel agencies, but I think the data quality underneath there needs to get a lot better, and I think it should be really widely adopted.
Thank you very much, Christian. So all of the topics are absolutely valid, and I think there's a lot of merit in all of them actually. Probably we could have a panel about each of these topics as well. So to say, as a second step, I would like to talk about actually the stakeholders in the market and what would actually be the implications for them and what action needs to be taken, what motivations needs to be offered to them. And I think maybe we start with the last example because I think it's a very, very good example and also something with a very tangible and close, realistic option of application. So as an aircraft design person, I obviously know the problem that like you have an A320 and it can fly easily 2,000 nautical miles with a full payload, even more. But then you see in the databases that it actually doesn't fly further more than 800 nautical miles in most of the cases. So, and now we see maybe a change in this with the 321 XLR, and I think that's a good point. And I mean, also there comes into space a different stakeholder, the airline, so to say, that, as you said, until now, wanted to have the flexibility. So I would like to discuss, like, how can we make this trade new under our new economic and especially ecologic boundary conditions, and what do you think can we offer, or could maybe policies or other governments, I don't know, offer as a motivation to foster this trend and actually to make it happen maybe more quickly?
Well, maybe if I just sure. may answer quickly to that last one, because I think talking about I sometimes question whether government regulation is always the right way. I think with transparency, I think it probably has to be the way, because I mean, airlines, basically the best paying customers of airlines are the business and first class customers, especially on the long range. But they are also the ones that take up the most space in the aircraft, so they will actually have the most carbon allocated to their seat. And so I think airlines will not be very excited to publish that themselves. So I think there probably has to be some sort of governmental or regulatory incentive, I would say. For the other aspect that we talked about, the narrow body long range flying, I think there we don't need an incentive from the government side, because you actually see some airlines doing it. JetBlue, for example, they are already starting to fly narrow body transatlantic, and TAP and Norwegian, likewise, Norwegian has just ordered those. So there will be more of these things happening in the very short future. But I think one aspect there is, I've heard in the industry that currently it's very difficult to get hands on these aircraft. So especially the LRs and XLRs, once they enter into service, it will be quite some time. So I think that's something to consider, is aircraft availability for this new business model.
Very interesting.
I'm generally
Transparency is certainly very important first step, but I'm generally a little bit skeptical. So I think also some government regulation needs to be enacted. So I'm an economist by training, so I believe in the power of markets and in the power of incentives, and probably governments or EU or ICAO has to set some kind of incentive in order to internalize these external effects of aviation, like the climate impact of aviation. But I also understand from the textbook's example, we can do this very nicely with carbon pricing and so on. But then when we transfer this over to the realities of global aviation policy, we really come to our limits. We've seen how long it has taken with Corsia on a global level, and I think it is really, very clear to say that this is probably not the absolute perfect solution to the problem. It's an important first step, certainly, but I think some kind of intervention, also maybe something that in the end airlines don't like, and we see currently the very big lobbyism on the one hand of airlines against the Fit for 55 package, or to change the Fit for 55 package, but also we see on the other side voluntary commitments of airlines like the Fly Net Zero of IATA for the year 2050. So I think certainly that there must be some kind of government intervention. Maybe also when I come to my example back of the non-CO2 effects, that air traffic control on the basis of real-time climate, weather data, temperature, humidity data, simply assigns the flight altitudes and flight paths to avoid the contrails. So just a little bit of a command and control regulation, but generally, certainly as an economist, I guess that the most favored solution would be internalizing the external effects by setting the incentives, by prices, carbon pricing and the like, in a very effective manner, and also very good for long-term planning, so that airlines can also plan ahead very long in advance.
Yeah, I think it's a good viewpoint and a valuable one. Jürgen, with your extensive experience with different stakeholders and maybe approaches, what tools can you think of?
I just reflected on what you said, Wolfgang, and I believe you also have a quality rating, so SkyTrack system, yeah, where all the airlines look at figuring out if they are 5-star or 4-star quality airlines. And maybe we need something like that also for carbon efficiency, yeah? And not sure if ICAO is the right organization to implement it, but it would be good if IATA would pick it up, for example, and to figure out how to get all the members really aligned behind a certain certification system, which is of course a political animal, and then really start counting on measuring best practice performance in operations and carbon efficiency. So that would be a difference maker for sure, and it would really accelerate this type of segmentation. Yeah, so we will see more aircraft, specific aircraft dedicated to specific ranges automatically, because it's more carbon efficient. So airlines get promoted. Yeah? We could even start thinking about incentivizing them directly, covering this in the European regulation, for example, as we do it with, or at least start doing it now with SAF. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I mean there are also technologies coming maybe even more sensitive to flexibility, so I think it is good to have tools that actually have a grab on this and that maybe countering trend from new technologies. That's absolutely valid, I think. Very well, I mean that was one point with the network structure. Wolfgang, how do you think would that actually impact the network structure? Like, do you see a trend there?
That's a very good question and a very good point, because when we look into network structures that are very carbon efficient, then that's probably in some cases those structures which are probably not most favored by passengers. So for instance, flying over very long distances is also very carbon inefficient, because when you think about the new Qantas services flying next year or so from London to Sydney, then the ton of fuel that is consumed on the approach of Sydney Airport has to be carried around 20,000 kilometers. So that is certainly something that cannot be efficient, but that is something that passengers very much like, because airlines do not only sell transport from A to B, they also sell time. And the airlines with the most time-efficient itinerary are the airlines which probably have the highest yields on that particular itinerary. So therefore we have an incentive for airlines to offer exactly those flights which are rather carbon inefficient. And that is something where probably in the future more intermediate stop operations, more hubs or stops along the way could be one option. But also on the other hand, I'm very optimistic, and I'm very good what Christian said with his analysis, that with smaller long-range aircraft, maybe we can have the best of both worlds, that we can on the one hand travel very efficient on the long haul, maybe also between secondary airports. So I'm based in Cologne and I look forward to the XLR, maybe we'll get a Cologne-New York flight again. So that could be one possibility. There are very exciting opportunities that come up with these new aircraft types.
I mean, that's a key word, and maybe we come to a draw here and to closure, and I would like to ask every one of you to maybe put into one or two sentences what you take from this discussion. Then I take the first turn. I, as an aircraft designer, of course, look forward to this opportunity and see some movement in the market. And I think that transparency for the consumers and for the performance of an airline is the best way to motivate actually restructuring of the network and of the airlines' fleets.
Yeah, I can only add to this. My final remark would really be to consider to leverage the true potential of CO2 efficient airline operation or aviation operation and a global CO2 efficient oriented classification scheme for more transparency and promoting a better operational platform. Now, this is really a fundamental starting point for higher investments in the aviation business, in business innovation, in climate-friendly business operations, instead of putting the money into ETS to get offsetted.
Personally, as a researcher, believe that we probably live in one of the most exciting times when it comes to the developments that lie ahead of us. So we see probably a very high dynamic on network structures, new aircraft types, maybe even the current structure that we have in terms of the global mega hubs will be to some extent maybe even weakened through more direct services with very efficient aircraft. And then on the other hand, we will also see a lot of transition to a more sustainable aviation system with sustainable aviation fuels and maybe even hydrogen aircraft in the long run. So that I find very exciting, and I'm very happy also to participate in this research, being a researcher at DLR.
Very good.
There's difficult something to add. I think there's you've mentioned very important aspects, but maybe just two smaller items. One is, I think, as we come into this time where there's going to happen and has to happen a lot of change in aviation, I think data will become even more important, ever more important, and therefore I think it's why we're here. And the second point is, I think we also have to start to think more out of the box to really do something and change something fundamentally. And I'm with you. I think this will be exciting times over the next couple of decades.
Thank you very much. I would say knowledge and data and exchange is everything. So thank all of you very much, Jürgen, Wolfgang, Christian, for the exchange here at the ILA 2022 at the Bauhaus booth. And I'm looking forward. We can continue discussion later on, but to the viewers online and actually also here at the booth, thank you very much for your attention. And tune in later for our other panel discussions or also small lectures. Thank you very much.